Good afternoon. I'm Warwick Sabin, Executive Director of the Society of Fellows, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this SOF Digital Discussion. I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe, and I want to thank you for being part of the Society of Fellows. And this is such an important election year and very unusual in so many ways. For starters, candidates are trying to figure out how to campaign without meeting people in person. And in only a few weeks, the two major political parties will hold their national conventions, but it looks like hardly anyone will physically be there. Ahead of those conventions, we thought it would be interesting to assess the full political landscape, including the presidential election, the battle for control of Congress, as well as the notable state and local races around the country. And we're fortunate to have assembled a fantastic panel of experts to help sort through it all. Mona Charen is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, a syndicated columnist, senior writer for thebulwark.com, and host of the weekly podcast Beg to Differ. She's worked in the White House and on presidential campaigns, and is the author of two best-selling books. And in 2010, she received the Eric Brundle Award for Excellence in Opinion Journalism. Bakari is a political analyst on CNN and practices law in South Carolina. He served as a state legislator in South Carolina, and in 2014, he was the Democratic nominee for lieutenant governor there. Bakari's been named to Time Magazine's 40 Under 40 list, as well as the Root 100 list of the nation's most influential African Americans. And the conversation between Mona and Bakari will be moderated by Eugene Scott, a political reporter at the Washington Post, where he covers identity politics for The Fix, the paper's political analysis blog. He previously worked for CNN, Time Magazine, the Arizona Republic, the Kansas City Star, and many other publications. He regularly provides on-air analysis for MSNBC, NPR, and CBS, and has won multiple awards for his work. And as with all of our SOF digital discussions, our panelists will be glad to answer your questions after the initial conversation, and you can submit your questions anytime by simply clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing them in. And if you encounter any problems during the event, please email the SOF hotline and our team will be glad to assist you. So our panelists are now going to be in conversation for the first 20 or 30 minutes, then I will pose your questions to them for the rest of the event. And now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Eugene Scott. Eugene?
Thanks so much, Warwick. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today, Mona and Bakari, and so very much looking forward to hearing just so many of your ideas and thoughts about where we are in this current moment. And so I just want to start pretty big picture. Like when you think about the 2020 electoral landscape, what is the first thing that comes to your mind, Mona?
This could be a historically huge landslide victory for the Democratic Party, perhaps larger than any in our lifetimes. It could be of Rooseveltian proportions, 1932. I have that sense that is possible this year.
And Bakari, what are the first things, or what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of this current electoral landscape?
Yeah, I don't have the confidence that Mona has because I am a Democrat and we're proverbial bedwetters. And so that's not a thought that I have. But when I think about where we are today, I think about how wrong we were in 2016. And I think about 53% of white women voting for Donald Trump, and trying to figure out how that will break, how that will change, what will be different about this cycle. That's what keeps me up at night. And also the 4 million people who voted for Barack Obama in 2012, but did not show up in 2016. If that doesn't change, then you'll have 4 more years of the 45th president of the United States. So I'm not as confident as Mona just yet.
I'm not confident, mind you. I'm just thinking.
I won't even speak it until November 4th. I'm just, I am somebody who has PTSD from 2016.
Yeah.
Well, as you all know, I write about identity politics for the Washington Post. And so I spend a lot of time focusing on how different groups are processing this election. And what we have seen is that there are some groups that went for Trump in 2016 that are less supportive of him in 2020. Some of them being suburban voters, white women, independent voters. He's not performing as well, even with like white working class voters, and to a lesser degree with white evangelicals, but still doing really well with that demographic than he was in 2016. Do these shifts give you any confidence, or do you feel like this is polling that perhaps cannot be trusted? Like when you hear that there are not as many people on the Trump train now as there were before, like what's your reaction to that?
Well, in the first place, we have to remember that 2016, Trump won. He played to an inside straight. He managed to lose the popular vote by more than 2 million votes, but he won the Electoral College because 70,000 voters in a few key states in the Midwest voted for him over Hillary. Those victories in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and other states were very narrow. They were very narrow victories. So if he is losing support in those key states, even if he's losing just a little, a few points can make the difference in the Electoral College. So it's highly significant that he's losing those votes. And as we saw in 2018, there has been an enormous shift in the suburban white vote. We saw that where a number of states all over the country, you saw voters who were normally Republican, white, conservatives living in the suburbs who crossed over and voted Democrat. And there's a lot of evidence that Trump has not been able to win them back in the intervening 2 years, and that they are in even larger numbers now contemplating voting for Joe Biden. It's an awfully good thing that the Democrats went with Biden, who's acceptable broadly to a large swath of independents and Republicans, than say if they had nominated Bernie Sanders. We'd be in a completely different environment. But because Biden is not threatening, not frightening to a lot of people who are more centrist in their approach, it's looking very good.
Yeah, and one of the things that I would remind people is I think it's been since, and I might be off by 4 years in either direction, but 1968, I do believe, that Democrats actually won the majority share of the white vote. And that would be somewhat startling. That would shake the foundations of what we know to be traditional politics today if Joe Biden even gets close to winning the majority share of white voters in this country. But Mona was right. I mean, this race comes down to a few states. I mean, I'm from South Carolina. I'm sitting in South Carolina now. It's not, I love my great state, but president ain't something that we really have a voice in. We're hoping that Jamie Harrison is able to pull that inside straight against Lindsey Graham, but it has to be a wave. But the states that really matter in terms of top tier states are Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania in tier 1. In tier 2, you have Florida. And then in tier 3, you have states like then North Carolina, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, et cetera. And so, when you look at the white vote or the share of the white vote, and you look at the shift of suburban voters, particularly suburban white women voters, you're starting to see that Joe Biden does have an ability to pull this off. But we still have a long way to go. If I'm not mistaken, again, we saw Dukakis, Jesus Christ, not Mondale, Dukakis with a 16-point lead 100 days out in his race, and he still lost. So again, we have a long way to go. We have COVID, we have people trying to vote throughout those things, and so we'll see what actually happens.
Well, Jean, can I respond to that?
Yeah, of course.
So I think what makes this year different, if we were talking about this race before COVID and before the George Floyd protests, we would be having a completely different conversation, because then all of the normal sort of tribalism of Republican versus Democrat would be in play. It would be very close. We'd be wondering how those Midwestern states were going to go. Florida would probably be safely Republican. What has changed in the last 6 months is that we have seen a massive disaster hit the country, and people are evaluating not they're not basing it, to talk about Gene's area of expertise, this is not an election that's going to be about identities. It's going to be about running the country competently. It's going to be a verdict on how Trump handled the two big crises that struck in the last 6 months, one being this terrible pandemic, and the other being the racial strife and the protests over police violence. He's being evaluated on those two things, and he's being found wanting on both of those very critical issues.
Mona, you know GOP voters better than Bakari and I want to know, why do you think this particular moment related to George Floyd, the aftermath, which was also very close in time to Breonna Taylor and some other incidents related to police violence, why do you think that appeared to strike such a chord with some demographics who in the past were not as sympathetic to issues of anti-Black racism from law enforcement?
Right. So I think a couple of things. One is that I think that Trump's relentless drumbeat of racial incitement has gotten under people's skin and bothered people, even people who think of themselves as conservative. But the other thing is video. It's video. You know, I mean, all those times in the past when we would hear about episodes of something happened between a police officer and a Black, pedestrian or a Black person, people would think, well, maybe that person was, more at fault. We don't know, and so on. These videos, and they've been accumulating over the last number of years as more and more people have cell phones, are just so damning, and they are so impossible to look away from. And that video of George Floyd is one of the most horrifying things that I think people have ever seen in this country. And so it struck a moral chord, and there was no, let's see the other side. There was no other side.
And Bakari, have you seen any changes, beyond Trump voters, but just in Americans and voters, period, in terms of how they are responding to this current moment of police violence? You've been following these incidents for years, even before you became a national political analyst. What are you seeing right now in terms of why people seem to be so still very much connected to these incidents in ways that they weren't previously?
Well, I think Mona's right in the fact that people could see the inhumanity of 8 minutes and 46 seconds for themselves. It's not something that someone said, but I mean, it was playing on every broadcast and cable news channel for, days and weeks on end. It's something that's seared in our conscience. Are people changing? There's an age-old political saying, trust but verify. So, I trust that things are changing, but we have to wait till we get into the polls to actually verify that that's happening. I mean, you have people from Carson Wentz and Trevor Lawrence, a quarterback for Clemson, speaking out, all the way to Taylor Swift, right? So there is a groundswell of movement for change. But in this country, we've missed these moments before, from Emmett Till to Selma. All the way through the Confederate flag being taken down off the Capitol when Mother Emanuel happened. We didn't necessarily kind of emerge from that better off as people thought we would. And so you have to be cautious as we go through this moment. And I'm still intrigued because there are a large number of Democrats who are begging the Democratic Party to understand that we know who Donald Trump is. Tell me what you're going to do for us. And there is a somewhat of a disconnect between the apparatus that I actually am a part of and trying to get to those grassroots voters to make sure they turn out. And I believe we're getting closer, and I believe that message is getting out, but it's one that has 99 days to get to where it needs to be, because the voters know who Donald Trump is, and people assume wrongfully that there is a choice just between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Well, as we saw in 2016, there is also a choice to choose the couch, and a lot of people chose the couch in that election. The difference is you don't have the two most unpopular candidates in the history of American politics running against each other. So that is a plus for Joe Biden, but it's still work to be done.
Indeed, indeed. One thing I'm very interested in, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, Bakari, is that it's not as if the only race on the ballot this fall is the one for the Oval Office. There's a lot of interest in seeing what will happen in the Senate and in Congress. And I would like to hear you all share about why those races are important and what impact they could have on the success of any presidency, depending on who wins. Mona.
Well, I might as well put my cards on the table and admit that I want to see a big Democratic victory this year, which I never thought I would hear myself saying. Until 2016, I had been a Republican for decades. And always voted Republican until 2018. Well, I didn't vote in 2016. I voted for another candidate. But yeah. But I do believe it's important this year that that people vote straight ticket Democrat, because the Trump malignancy has to be stamped out, and it has to be very, very firm and obvious and overwhelming. And that means that Republicans at every level have to be punished for having enabled and not stood up to this man. And so that's where I am. I'm hoping that, and it's looking like the Democrats are going to take the Senate and hold the House. So hopefully once they are in charge of everything, they won't be too irresponsible. And when that happens, I'll start criticizing. But for now, I would like to see them win.
Mm-hmm. And Bakari, you were talking about the importance of these races. I mean,
it's going to be tough for Democrats to win the Senate. I think one of the more dangerous men in the country outside of Attorney General Barr is probably Mitch McConnell. It's tough. I think Democrats would do extremely well because we had amazing candidates grow some sense of self and begin to have these moments of introspection, referring to Hickenlooper and Bullock, by going home and running in races that will help change the trajectory of the union. So Hickenlooper in Colorado and Bullock in Montana. I was like, where is he from? Montana. As well as in Arizona, you have Mark Kelly, who's in a very interesting race, who should pull that out. So that would make it a close Senate, right? But if the Democrats are able to pull off an upset of Tom Tillis, for example, in North Carolina, then you start to see a majority, close majority, 51-49 type majority. And I think that's where kind of the rubber meets the road in some of these outlier races. And then if they actually beat like Joni Ernst in Iowa, which is a really weirdly close race. And I forget about one of the races Democrats also have to win is Susan Collins' race as well. But all of these things are within reach. Now, if you look at the scoreboard and Democrats are winning in Georgia, then you know that this is you just pop the champagne. It's a good night, because that is pretty much over. But it's going to be, those are some of the races that are key races to at least make it close. I think it's going to be a night. We will decide the Senate on election night, but it's going to be really close.
Yeah. And
one of the other reasons it's so important to have a big win is that Trump has done everything possible to undermine faith in the election and to suggest fraud and to suggest cheating. Mm-hmm. So if it's a huge blowout victory, it's much harder for him to claim fraud. And so that's another reason that those people who are considering the couch get off it and get to the polls, or ask for their mail-in ballot.
Yeah. Despite concerns coming from the White House about voter fraud, we have seen no data to support that it exists. Certainly not at the level that the president and his allies believe it to be. But what we have seen some suggestion and evidence of is voter suppression, especially in the South, where we have seen people waiting in lines in predominantly Black and predominantly low-income neighborhoods at lengths of time that just quite frankly seem just short of ungodly in a democracy. And I imagine that has to cause some anxiety among people who really want to see Americans get out and vote, because they fear that people will not go vote if they feel like they have to wait in line for 4 hours for various reasons. Some obviously will not want to, but a lot of people cannot because of their lives and other responsibilities. When you think about voter suppression and accusations of it, like what are some of your first thoughts that come to mind regarding that?
So sometimes what gets called voter suppression is really local incompetence, such as we saw in Iowa during the primaries. Remember the caucuses? They were a complete disaster. Sometimes local officials do a bad job. Yeah. Other times it's because people in the state, at the state level, have introduced all kinds of hoops that you have to jump through, such as having your name exactly the way it was on the form you filled out, no dashes, can be different, and then they throw out ballots for really trivial reasons. That is also something that goes on and can cause problems. So, you know, I would say there are different reasons for it, but I completely agree that it's outrageous, and especially that people should have to wait online for hours to vote, and particularly this year when it is a danger to your health as well as your time to spend that much time in line. So, you know, mail-in ballots seem to be the answer this year. And unfortunately, the president is doing everything he can to undermine that. And by the way, even in a self-defeating fashion, because frankly, older voters tend to be more Republican in their leanings, and they would be the ones at most risk because of this virus. And yet he's discouraging older voters from asking for mail-in ballots, which may wind up biting him.
Yeah, voter suppression is real, and when I think about it, you know, somebody who did voter suppression really, really well was Scott Walker. Scott Walker harkened back to days of old, and also Brian Kemp recently. When you ask me when you frame the question as what comes to mind first about voter suppression, the first thing I think about is Georgia, right? I mean, you got these lines that are 4 or 5 hours long. I think that in the primary, the longest person waiting in line was 7 hours to vote in 2020. Like that should not, you know, I don't care who they were voting for. I mean, they could have been voting for David Duke. They still don't need to be waiting in line for 7 hours, right? That's just not something that should happen. And now you overlay that with the pandemic, and, you know, even in the election in Wisconsin, the primary election in Wisconsin was the first one after the pandemic where they still had to go to the ballots. And we saw that, you know, 8-9 people contracted COVID-19 while voting. So there are some new inherent dangers. I honestly don't think anything's going to stop people from showing up this go around, though. As Mona hearkened, the importance of this is just beyond what we know. And I think that we're going to see lines across the country of people standing 6 feet apart, just with masks on, waiting to cast their ballot. I think there's going to be, I think the president of the United States did something that will backfire on him by creating all of this mistrust in mail-in ballots. One, Republicans like to use mail-in ballots even more than Democrats, but two, there's going to be a rush on polling places, and I think that people are going to, you know, feel some sense of safety and security by actually casting their ballot and not mailing it in. So I don't know. I feel firm that we'll know who wins the Senate on November 3rd. I'm not sure if we'll know who wins the presidency for a week or two after.
Sure. You hinted at this earlier, the idea of an enthusiasm gap. And there have been these polls about how Trump supporters are far more enthusiastic about backing him in November than those individuals who want to vote for Biden. But I want to hear your reaction to that. But personally, I'll just share. I don't think enthusiasm for Biden is the correct measuring stick to determine whether or not people are going to come out and vote for him. I think there's something to be said about people enthusiastically voting against Trump. Based on some of my on-the-ground reporting and just talking to people and listening to voters. What role do you think enthusiasm or zeal about going to the polls will play in how people vote this fall?
Yeah, I tend to agree about this. Back during the primaries, we kept hearing that Biden didn't have big crowds, and that there was, all the energy was for Bernie or for Elizabeth Warren or whatever. And then, as it turned out, when the votes were cast, Elizabeth Warren didn't even win her own state. Bernie Sanders didn't get as many votes as Biden. The new voters who were energized and came out actually turned out for Biden, not for Bernie Sanders. But also these questions, when they say, how enthusiastic are you? They rule out one of the possible answers, right? They say, well, I'm mostly voting for him and against, but they don't say, if Donald Trump were running against a can of tomato soup, who would you vote for? And I think a good number of people would respond the tomato soup. So that's hard to measure in these things, but we know they're out there. We see them. We talk to them. We'll see.
So one of the unique statistics that I saw is that among individuals in 2016 who disliked both candidates, Donald Trump walked away with a resounding victory. Like if they didn't like Hillary or Trump, they voted 2/3 to 1/3 Donald Trump. He's getting smashed this go round, like 90-10 for those candidates who dislike both for those voters who dislike both candidates. I just feel like Donald Trump offends the most individuals' notions of common decency, or maybe that's my youthful naivete, so let me believe that. And I don't think there's going to be this undercounting. Like in 2016, people were ashamed to say they were voting for Donald Trump. They wouldn't tell you. I don't see that being the case now, that there is this kind of undercurrent. There is this silent majority of voters. I'll tell you a funny story because I know we're going to questions and I know we don't really have a lot of time for story time, but Steve Shell is the king of Florida, right? Steve is brilliant. Steve ran Florida for Obama. He's running a super PAC right now. He ran Florida for Obama in 2008 and 2012. And so Gloria Borger and I were, we both had this, we had all this Florida data, but it came from the same person. It was Steve. And so the night before the election, we called Steve and Steve's like, look, I ran 13 simulations, and of those 13, Hillary Clinton wins 12 in the state of Florida, right? So on election night, probably about 7:30, 7:45, 8 o'clock, Steve calls us, or he texts us and says, it's raining white voters. Like white voters were coming out of nowhere that he did not, nobody calculated for this share of the white vote. All of Hillary's votes were banked early in early voting. There wasn't a huge election day turnout for her. And that one circumstance that he didn't imagine happened. I don't see, back to the inside straight, I don't see that happening again for Donald Trump. I could be wrong, but I just don't see that happening again.
Yeah, indeed. One thing, though, that I think is really interesting that we touched on earlier is new voters. And there was some, thought that new voters during the primary would come out for some other candidates besides Biden. But what we saw is that a significant percentage of new voters who came out were actually coming out for Biden. How do we get new voters who still are not engaged as of now to show up? What would it take to perhaps motivate them to get involved in this election if they have not yet decided to do so? I'm going to start with you, Bakari. This is a pitch to the vice presidential picks, possibly.
Yeah, no. So what's crazy? I still believe that if the numbers continue to go haywire for white women and suburban voters, as Mona talked about earlier, that Donald Trump will dump Mike Pence and get Nikki Haley. Like that's my conspiracy theory that changes the entire landscape of the race. I do think that Joe Biden has an amazing opportunity as vice president to choose somebody who can add a value to the ticket. And it's hard now, though, with COVID-19, you can't get out and campaign like you used to. But I do anticipate him choosing a vice president, hopefully, that will add some value to the ticket and utilizing the 44th president to turn those same voters you were talking about out.
Yeah. Mona, how do you think we can get voters off the couch to perhaps then participate in 2016?
Well, I don't know about Bakari's theory, because I think the downside to him dropping Pence and picking up Nikki Haley would be intense. I mean, the fact is his most loyal constituency is evangelical Protestants, and that's the constituency that he was courting when he chose Pence initially. He'd have a lot of splaining to do if he dropped him. So I don't think that's going to happen. But look. I'm at a loss. I mean, if the country is in a horrible emergency, we've got 140,000 people dead. We have an economy that is near collapse. I mean, we are in an emergency. And if this isn't enough to get people to say, I think we need someone other than a boob con man in the Oval Office, I don't know how you get them off the couch.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. When I talk to people who are not engaged, I often find myself wondering what it would take at this point, just out of curiosity, like, because I just have no idea how people are still apathetic. And I say that with no condemnation. I just say that out of being genuinely perplexed.
Yeah.
Because as you said, we're in so many crises right now. And along those lines, I mean, it's hard to think about what you think should be the main priority of a president, a president who's not Trump, so Biden, if he is successful in November, given the mess that many people currently believe that we are in. What do you think he should focus on first?
I was going to write a column about this, and so I'm giving you a preview. Sure. But one of the first things that Franklin Roosevelt did was there were runs on banks in 1932 and 33 when he actually took office. And one of his first actions was to declare what he called a bank holiday, which was a nice way of saying he closed all the banks for a day or two so that people couldn't try to get their money out, right? Because when a bank cannot survive a run. But that was taking charge of the situation right from Washington. And when it comes to the coronavirus, we desperately need national leadership. And I say this as somebody who loves federalism and believes in it. And in most areas, I think local is better. But when it comes to this, no, because if we were able to have a unified national approach where we said for 3 weeks, this country is shutting down and only absolutely essential workers are going to leave their homes, we are really going to shut it down, we could break the back of the virus. That is what it would take, but that requires national leadership. So I would hope to see a President Biden say, I'm declaring a virus holiday, and we are going to beat this thing together as an entire country. We're going to have a huge shutdown. It's going to be for 3 weeks. We can get through this. And only absolutely essential workers will go to work.
So we're assuming that Kanye West will not be president? I mean, what is the assumption here, Eugene? I'm just trying to figure this thing out.
I haven't seen any polling. In your native South Carolina, which he launched this campaign in, he didn't even turn in this ballot.
But he did qualify today for the New Jersey ballot, right?
Oh,
because New Jersey and Illinois will make a difference nowhere, okay? I just want some normalcy, to be honest with you. What Mona said is a bold step. What's necessary? My fear, though, is that we would have already gone through the worst by January 21st, I think is the day after inauguration. So that may be late because hopefully by then, if I'm not mistaken, we should have a vaccine around that time. So hopefully we hope that it's going to be bad this winter. And I just pray that we get some leadership from somewhere before then. I just want a president not to tweet. I want a president to go about daily work and allow us to forget that he exists. I don't want to be exhausted by the 24-hour news cycles that happen to be 8 times in one day. And I want to recapture global standing because I hate traveling around the world. And I'm sure both of you all get it when you travel. They're like, man, tell me, how did y'all end up with Donald Trump? Like, what is that? And it's just, you just feel some sort of way about it. And so I just want that return to global stature. And I think that's something, Joe Biden ain't the most exciting candidate, but the character traits that he does have make him an extremely good leader. Things like compassion and empathy, wanting to work with others and believing in the better angels of our nature. I expect boring things like an infrastructure bill, which will drive the market up, put people back to work. Things that are necessary, repairing the infrastructure of a country that's 100 years behind schedule. So that's kind of what I expect policy-wise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting how, I think people who just got engaged in national politics with the Trump presidency may not understand that for the most part, policy making isn't sexy and it's not entertaining and it's
That's
not
right.
supposed to be engaging and record-breaking, news broadcasts. I mean, it is supposed to just be boring a lot of times, but that would be refreshing to a lot of people, and I think that's what a lot of people are looking forward to. But I want to pivot to some questions. We've got some folks who've written in. Warwick, you want to help us with that?
Absolutely. And by the way, thank you. This has been a great conversation. You all have covered a lot of ground already. We do have a bunch of questions in. I want to remind our audience, if you do want to submit a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Just hit that, write it in, and we will try to get to it. The first question, and I'm afraid Bakari may have answered it with the sweatshirt he's wearing, but Gene Golden is asking for your favorite picks for Biden's vice presidential nominee, and maybe you could add some color to that in terms of why and the strengths and weaknesses there.
Mona, you want to go first?
Sure. I am Team Duckworth, Tammy Duckworth, because she has the most inspiring American story. She was born in Thailand. Her mother was Thai, her father an American Air Force officer, I believe. She had obviously served her country and lost both of her legs. She then got into elective politics. She is not an extreme left-winger. She's a liberal, but more moderate than some. And I just think that the choice of her, and by the way, the choice of VP, I should just say, is a political science matter. We know that VP choices do not help a candidate get elected, they can only hurt. So bearing that in mind, I think that she would be a very safe choice, a good choice, and I think that she would be ready to be president, and she's inspiring.
I mean, from what I know and speaking to people who know people, and Eugene probably knows many of the same people, I think that the president's going to make a very personal choice between Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris, with Susan Rice being a dark horse. I think uniquely enough, as much as I am a Kamala Harris supporter, there are a lot of attributes in terms of who should be your vice president. I just had Hillary Clinton on my podcast, and she said the number one thing you should be able to do is actually like the person, right? Because even if they have the ability to be president day one and you don't like them, none of that matters. I think that Susan Rice checks that box off above everyone else who's able to go into the White House and lead on day one and be president day one is Susan Rice. I think she's a dark horse for president. I think that most people will tell you that it's a slam dunk for him to choose Kamala Harris. The unique thing about being Democrats is that we miss dunks and layups all the time. So,
can I just say something about Susan Rice? Very impressive person. I think it's a mistake to pick someone who's never been involved in electoral politics. I think the chances of them screwing up on the campaign trail are much higher than a person who's been through it.
That's a fact. I agree with you on that.
Our next question comes from Arthur Sibergeld. He asks, what influence do you think the Never Trump and Lincoln Project groups will have on the moderate vote based on the ads that you've seen so far?
Well, Never Trumpers have gone from being irrelevant and yesterday and so unimportant to now supposedly being all important. Look, it does matter, I think. And Republican voters against Trump also have been running very, very effective ads. Effective because they are ads of actual Republican individuals that they recorded themselves on their laptops saying, I voted for Trump in 2016 and I can't do it again, or I didn't vote for him in 2016, but here's why I want my old party back. So it does give a permission structure for people who are not really comfortable, voting for a Democrat to say, well, just this once, because of this particular guy, Trump, it's okay to vote for the Democrat. And that can matter in those states, as we were discussing, with the voters that the suburban voter that will tilt a number of those Midwestern states could be critical.
No, I just think the aggressiveness by which they campaign gives Democrats more so the energy and thirsting of what we've been missing. Oh my God, this is what Republicans do against us all the time. You're kind of thirsting to have that fortitude and that tenacity, kind of, balls to the wall. This is what campaigns are, and Democrats have been missing that for a long period of time. But with Lincoln Project and another Trumpers, you get it.
Wonderful. And our next question. And I don't have a name with this one, but we know that Russians strategically targeted interest groups in America on both sides to stoke the flames of disagreement in the last election. Is there evidence that they will take the next step to attempt to infiltrate our electronic election infrastructures? I should mention, vote by mail also, of course, is another place where, there's this sort of fear of infiltration.
Not only the fear of infiltration, but when the American government is not doing anything in response to it, that's when you have a problem. When we have bills on Mitch McConnell's desk, when you have an attorney general that refuses to do anything, these are real problems. But it's not just Russia; it's also Iran as well, and China. And so when you have this kind of conglomerate of efforts without any pushback, that fear is well placed.
And I would just mention that in the Mueller report, there are citations to the fact that the Russians did indeed try to hack actual voting records. They weren't successful, but they did try. So that's something that it should have all of us with our hair on fire. And I think Mueller was amazed at how little response that got.
Okay, and then this question, I think Eugene, you might even want to kind of jump in on this one. It's from Ann Lipton, and she asks, what are you seeing among evangelical Christians in the Midwest?
Well, what we're seeing among evangelical Christians, and specifically white evangelicals in the Midwest, is something that we're seeing among white evangelicals nationally. Some of the razor thin falling off in support from Trump is happening with a lot of white evangelical women and younger white evangelicals, millennials. And even white suburban evangelicals. And I know there's some overlap with that. But I think a very important anecdote to give you regarding these related to my reporting is significant percentages of demographics that voted for Trump in 2016 actually agree with Black Lives Matter or are sympathetic to those protesting against police violence against Black people. And Trump has been very vocal in trying to paint demonstrators as Antifa and rioters and violent in a way that's not catching on. And one of the reasons why it's not catching on is because while Trump is tweeting that this is what is happening in the streets, many of these protesters are actually the children and the relatives and co-workers of some of these Trump supporters. And they have, the president's narrative going one way, and they actually have these real examples. And one example I remember, a young man I spoke with whose parents are diehard Trump supporters were complaining in the family group chat about what Trump said the protesters were. And he said, Mom and Dad, I actually got tear gassed last night. I was down at the White House. And so when you have these people who actually have evidence or a narrative that goes against what they're hearing from Fox News or from Trump's Twitter feed, they're rethinking their view of these issues and their allegiance to the president. And we know that, or at least we believe, that this election could be won by percentage points. And so losing, 3% in Kansas and Missouri, it's not anything to be, taken lightly. And there were protests in St. Louis and Kansas City and Wichita, and many of them were people who voted for Trump in the past or Trump voter adjacent.
Got it. Was there anything that Mona, Bakari, you wanted to add to that?
I know we're up against time. I'll just say thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I did want to kind of squeeze in one more question, because we intentionally titled this event Everything at Stake, because, we talked about all these different elections, but the Supreme Court also is very much at stake in terms of, who will serve as president in the next 4 years, because they will very, very likely have the chance to, appoint, if not one, maybe even two Supreme Court justices. So I wanted to kind of end with a question about, what influence you think that will have in motivating voters to the polls on either side, because certainly also, unfortunately, there's possibly some uncertainty even this year in that regard.
There is uncertainty, and it's worrisome, because if there's one thing that we do not need at this moment, when we have so many crises facing us and we are already so riven as a society, we do not need a fight over a Supreme Court vacancy right now. That would be terrible, and so I'm hoping that it doesn't happen. I will say that in general, Republican voters are much more motivated by the Supreme Court than Democratic voters. It's listed as an issue for them more than for Democrats. And so on the other hand, reality has barreled through this year, and we have the virus and we have the Floyd protests. And so those things have overshadowed the court. Plus, Trump was able to get 2 appointments. The urgency is a little less this time around.
Yeah, no, my final parting remarks are we need to always bubble wrap RBG and bubble wrap Stevie Wonder. I think we just need to make sure that both of them are all good under any circumstances.
Okay. On that note, I want to thank all 3 of you for participating today. This has been an incredible conversation. Mona, Bakari, appreciate your insights. Eugene, wonderful job moderating. We really appreciate all 3 of you being with us. I want to thank our audience, of course, for being here with us as well. I want to remind them, next Thursday, we have a great program. We've got Peter Gelb, the head of the Metropolitan Opera in New York, along with Wynton Marsalis, the world-recognized, celebrated musician. They're going to be in conversation about the future of performing arts in the digital space, since that seems to be the way that we all have to enjoy it these days. So that'll be next Thursday. Until then, I hope you stay healthy and safe. Thank you for all of your support. And thank you for being a member of the Society of Fellows. Have a great day.